Right, greetings, hello. This is Dr. Thomas Daffern speaking, greetings. It's my weekly Sunday talk, my day of fasting for world peace and sanity and, it started over a year ago, really, me protesting against Brexit, which I thought was the most stupid thing ever invented, and I still do. But then, since then, there have been some other stupid things that have broken out. Most recently, this coronavirus pandemic, which I'm going to be addressing now, and among other things today. So, it's we're in a very strange world situation since I started this fasting, and I'm going to carry on until we get resolution and truth, actually. I think the most important thing for me as a philosopher, as you know, is truth. And in all traditions, all theologies, truth is the fundamental thing. It's called Dharma in Buddhist and Hindu terminology. It's called sometimes called emet in Hebrew, but it's implicit in the Torah. It's what one studies. It's the Torah, which is the equivalent of Dharma in Buddhist and Eastern thought. In Christianity, it's an aspect of the Trinity, and it's the quality that the Holy Spirit brings into incarnation, which I think is very similar to the concept of the Shekinah in Judaism. Shekinah is the goddess who is the consort, as it were, of the invisible, unknowable God, Yahweh, the fire that we can't look at. What we can cope with is the Shekinah, which is the goddess, and that brings a light of grace upon us all, and that is also the Holy Spirit. So there's very, very close theological link between Judaism and Christianity, and it's tragic that they've been arguing for the last 2,000 years, over I suppose, over who is the Messiah. I mean, it's the wrong question. I mean, the Messiah is all of us. We are that. The Messiah is just as every child is loved equally by a mother, so each child in incarnation, each soul is loved equally by the Shekinah, and each child is therefore, as it were, the Messiah. So the argument over whose Messiah is best is a specious and false, epistemologically inaccurate argument, and I'm speaking as a philosopher here, a critic of conventional messianic discourse, which is, always like, ours is the only one, ours is the best, ours is going to be the best Jewish Messiah, or ours is the only one, ours is the Christian one, ours is Christ, all the others are false. And it creates this dialectic of, anti-Messiah. So you've got the Antichrist dialectic, which goes on. People that believe strongly in the only Messiah concept also believe very strongly, normally, in the we're out to get the Antichrist concept, which then precipitates vast conflicts and wars, and you can trace them in history all the way back, as I've done. I'm saying it's time to make truce, time to make a peace deal. That's why I wrote a book on comparative diabology, because behind the anti-Messiah concept is the devil concept. Lurking behind that is a kind of whole bunch of theological assumptions, which I think are, can be criticised and can be taken apart. A colleague of mine, Ernst Gellner, who's dead now, a sociologist, wrote a book about the devil sociologically. I've followed on with my book on comparative diabology. We have to undo this whole narrative and make peace, if we're capable of it as human beings. I mean, we like our Messiah versus anti-Messiah narratives because it makes us feel like we're on the winning side, the right side, and they're evil and we're good, and that gives us a sense of righteousness, and we can win, so to speak. This is the intellectual justification for all forms of terrorism. I mean, terrorism of the extreme right or the extreme left. It's the same narrative, actually. It's just secularized into a political narrative, which is that, our team, the left, is going to defeat your team, the right, and we are the best ones, we're the winners of history. So this has inspired the long march of communism, since Lenin took up the sword and decided to use the sword, which then in turn inspired Maoism and God knows Pol Pot, all the extreme left violence outbreaks, tragically. But it also inspired the extreme right, which then stood against the extreme left. So Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, all the extreme rightists, who are still among us, there's lineages of them, just as there are of the lineages of the extreme left. They're still fighting. I mean, like some sort of crazy crusaders that have never declared peace. They're still trying to kill the other guys. So I'm speaking as a peace philosopher. How on earth can we make peace here? So that's one thing I'm going to be addressing. The other thing is, and to make it all worse, we're in the middle of this global pandemic, which may or may not have an origin in human tinkering with science. Some kind of mad scientist group. We're in the dark on that. So I will be addressing that topic at the end of my talk. I'm going to save it to then. Otherwise it'll take over the whole talk, really. Okay, so what I first want to talk about is some very good news, right? So I've been busy. You can't say I'm never not active. I've been busy since we last spoke last week on publishing a feasibility study, which I first published in 1991. I mean, would you believe it? That's nearly 30 years ago, 29 years. It's just slipped past like that. It's ridiculous. In 1989, I was elected to undertake a feasibility study into creating a Peace Studies Institute at the University of London. And I then spent 2 years intensive research at the Institute of Education, interviewing people, talking to people, either who were visiting London, scholars involved in peace studies. I met most of the leading people involved in that field, and conflict resolution research and conflict research. I met John Burton and the whole conflict resolution school. I met Johan Galtung and Elise Boulding and the whole peace studies school. And I interviewed them all. I recorded interviews with them. And I also went travelling. I went to Scandinavia. I went to Stockholm Peace Research Institute, always checking out the libraries, of course, looking at what kind of libraries they had. I went to Denmark, Copenhagen, Norway. I went to Oslo, to the Nobel Prize Foundation, and so on and so on. I travelled to France. I went to Czechoslovakia, to Berlin, and to Moscow, always asking academics, what are you doing for peace? How do you teach it? Do you teach it? Do you have a Centre for Peace Studies? And I compiled all the stuff into archives, which are all up in one of the rooms here in the Peace Museum. And they're really quite, interesting, because I had correspondence with hundreds of academics all over the world who were interested in peace and conflict resolution from both sides, from capitalist, communist, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever, from all countries. Well, not all, but a lot, right? And then I compiled it all and I said, well, look, the University of London can have an institute. We need to look at this stuff. This is probably one of the most vital areas of study in today's world. Britain is a nuclear weapons state. We're threatening to blow up God knows what, Moscow and 20, 30 other cities. Why don't we study peace and see if we can find another path than endless wars? So I published that feasibility study in 1991. I worked for a committee of the great and the good. I was appointed by a committee including several Nobel Prize winners and members of the Royal Society, and experts who'd been working in this field for ages. I was just a young boy. A young man. I was in my 20s, late 20s. And these people were in their 60s, 70s. Some of them have been... John Burton was at the founding conference of the United Nations. He was part of the Australian diplomatic corps. Professor Cedric Smith, who was another person on the council, who was a scientist at University College, he was Britain's leading expert in the mathematics of genetics. Amazing man, lovely man, and a Quaker and a peace activist. He'd been friends, chums with people who were working on the Turing, quest for Enigma codes and stuff. He'd been tangentially involved in all that. And he even had met the rather unpleasant German geneticist called Verschuer, who was involved in the Nazi genetic research during World War II and up to World War II. He ran an institute in Berlin which did genetical research. And he was the advisor of Mengele, who was doing experiments in Auschwitz on largely Jewish prisoners, and tinkering about like a mad scientist, right? Mengele survived the war. I think he escaped to Argentina. Verschuer was captured. He was never imprisoned or punished beyond a token, because what happened was a lot of these Nazi scientists were wanted by either the Soviet bloc or the Western bloc, and so we kind of overlooked what they'd done. Now Cedric Smith didn't agree with this. He'd been flabbergasted to be at a conference in Copenhagen on genetics where Verschuer had been speaking, and he gave me a book called Murderous Science about not just Verschuer but all the Nazi scientists. And he said, Thomas, the reason we need an Institute of Peace Studies at London is so that we don't let these people repeat these mistakes. Like me, he believes science has an ethical duty. It's not ethically free. There's this kind of concept got out that science is ethically neutral. It has nothing to say about good and evil. It just is pure knowledge, and knowledge is power. And so it can be accumulated, patented, developed, So that's where we get to the possibility of people doing advanced biological weapons research that some people are saying is the origin of the pandemic. Now, I suspend judgment. If Cedric Smith in heaven, hello Cedric, was, still my line manager, he would say, Thomas, we don't know. We have to suspend judgment. It's what's called epoché is the term in philosophy. It's the suspension of judgment is incredibly important. It's the basis of Husserl's philosophical work, and it's the basis of Pyrrho of Elis, who was the introducer of skepticism into Greek philosophy, who probably, certainly met Jain philosophers who taught him this idea, which was what's called Anikantavada, the many-sidedness of truth. So you have to suspend judgment and work it out, And that's what many people on the planet are trying to do with this virus. What I would say, following Cedric Smith's caution to me when I was appointed to my post, is you can't actually trust the mad scientists. I mean, they really are mad, and some of them are evil. And of course they want to spread the idea that science is value-free and it is well, that's nonsense. I'm speaking as a philosopher, that science is an offshoot of philosophy. There'd be no such thing as science without philosophy. And it was originally called natural philosophy. When Newton was professor at Cambridge, I think he was professor of mathematics, but the field was called natural philosophy. I mean, science as such simply is a word for knowledge, right? And knowledge is not value-free. This is the point that philosophers have been making since we first started knowing how to talk, right? This is Socrates' point. Knowledge and virtue go together. It's ignorance and evil that go together. What people like Verschuer and their cronies and these dark scientists do, that's not science, that's nescience. And a lot of people that masquerade as so-called scientists are actually nescientists. This is a word I've coined, it's in my dictionary of new words, which as a philosopher I've coined, about 200 new words, which I recommend people can use. They're useful tools for thinking. And a nescientist is the kind of scientist that wants to shut up discussion about ethics, values, purpose, meaning, and just trot out a sort of descriptive materialist analysis of phenomena they've witnessed and seen without asking how or why it does what it does. And then with that perspective, as a nescientist, you can then tinker with stuff to weaponize viruses, to weaponize things. I mean, I watched a chilling documentary in the week on Porton Down, because I'm obviously in my sights are these biological weapons labs capable of making, weaponizing things like coronavirus, and Porton Down is one of them. And I'm demanding investigations and inspections of all these labs worldwide by the UN under the Bioweapons Convention. And Porton Down should be inspected. Now, what it's done in the past is horrendous. And it's very interesting, it stockpiled sarin gas, which was being made by the Nazis during World War II. And it's a nerve agent. It could have, it kills you very quickly in the most horrendous way. They had huge stockpiles, but Hitler actually never let it be used. It's very interesting. He might have won World War II had he let his generals use sarin gas at Stalingrad and bombing British cities. He said no, draw the line at that. Which is interesting because, but the British, when we discovered the stockpiles of sarin gas at the end of World War II after we conquered Germany, then loads was shipped to Porton Down and we started experimenting with it. And actually they killed some volunteers with it in Porton Down, as I discovered. And they were doing live tests on people, right, up until not that long ago. And now they just do them on animals. But this is horrendous. All this stuff to me is nescientists. Okay, so let's come back to that at the end. I want to talk more about the feasibility study because you see this book, which it represents 2 years of my life, research. I wrote it for the University of London, and it represents a crucial moment in my own intellectual journey because I was working at quite high level with amazing thinkers and academics all over the world. Some of them, sadly, are now dead. A lot of the people I met, Kenneth Boulding, a great economist, a visionary futurist, a poet, a Quaker, a husband of Elise Boulding. Some of these founding fathers and mothers of peace studies, they're dead now. But in my feasibility study, I've got reports of correspondence and meetings. I organised lectures at the University of London for them. And, there's a whole series of work. And then it was published. It was distributed only to the committee, really. It was never publicly published. You can't buy it in a bookshop. It was an internal document for the University of London and our committee. And then on the basis of it, I then launched my International Institute of Peace Studies, which was initially, up until '96, was housed at the Institute of Education. And then after that, it went freelance because the Institute, like all academia in Britain, became very cost conscious. You couldn't have a niche unless you were able to pay loads of overheads and things. And we were trying to raise funds, but didn't succeed. Strangely enough, there's very little money for peace research. There's vast amounts. If I'd have been making weapons of mass destruction, if I'd have been a Vacheur or a tinkering nescientist, I'd be, on a vast salary and driving, with my own private jets. That's how the nescientists are operating. No, if you're trying to get peace research going at the University of London, sorry, do it on a shoestring, which is kind of how I've had to operate ever since. But so then it went autonomous. We became a freestanding institute. I mean, I still was teaching at the University of London up until 2000, actually, still lecturing for them and in different places, mainly at Birkbeck College, which is the extramural academic centre. And E.F. Schumacher used to teach at Birkbeck, so I think I'm in reasonably good company. And I only stopped teaching there because I moved to Wales, effectively. It was too far to travel. And then I trained as a secondary school teacher because academic posts were hard to find in Britain at that time. But the Institute carried on. So the Institute I launched on the back of the feasibility study is still going. I'm the director. We have a network of people all over the planet. And it's now based here in France, having been 7 years in Scotland. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. Those of you that know me know all this, or some of it. What's never been made public before is the actual feasibility study that launched the whole thing. And I've published it, I think, yesterday. So I want a pat on the back, really, because it was an awful lot of work over the 2 years when I wrote it. It's been a lot of work in the last few weeks to knock it into shape such that it can be published. And finally it's there, you can read it. This is the evidence base, if you want to use jargon, for the foundation of the Institute. And I've done it as a public service. I'm a very old-fashioned type of academic. I believe that scholars, experts, scientists, doctors should study some field in detail and generally and all around, and become an expert in that field, and then share that with the public, share that with their students, share that with society. And that knowledge should in some way enhance or, augment the well-being of the general society, the general public. I mean, I worked in hospitals and I very nearly became a medical doctor. I decided to go into social science and philosophy because I felt actually I could do more use, because there are loads of medical doctors and I love them and they're brilliant, and I sat at the feet of many that I've known. And they all, most of them, and there are exceptions, there are the Shiptons, there are horrendous doctors, most of them are good. But, it's limited what you can do in conventional medicine. So I decided to become a free-thinking, out-of-the-box philosopher, social scientist and peace thinker. I felt I could make more of a contribution, longer term. And I'm gauging the impact of my work not in the next 10 years, not in the next 50 years, actually. I'm interested in the much, much bigger picture. The work I've done called Being and Knowledge is a kind of attempt to do a synthesis of the dynamic of all known knowledge. It's a kind of encyclopedia of the pragmatics of the knowable, set against ethics and spirituality and what we know of metaphysics. It's a kind of it's a huge work that I think is going to take several hundred years to for humanity to fully understand what I've been doing, if we survive, if philosophers are around to read it. So that's kind of where I'm coming from now. Why am I concerned, therefore, about the state of play at the moment? Well, the Peace Studies report I did way back 30 years ago, has still been not fulfilled. We don't have our institute at the University of London. Peace Studies is still not taken seriously. The governments of the world still invest in military research, war studies, strategic studies, weapons research, including biological warfare research and nuclear research. And this is unacceptable to me as a philosopher. It's unacceptable to the committee that I was appointed by. It's unacceptable to all the Nobel Prize winners, I think, not just the Peace Prize winners, but all of them. This is a madness that humanity is doing, and I think the long term is the coronavirus lockdown. This is our chance to really review. There's a wonderful passage in the book of Revelations where it says, St. John says, and there was silence in heaven for half an hour. This is that time. This is that silence in heaven for half an hour. And it's our time to really go deeply and reflect and work on our calibration of good and evil. Where do we stand on this? Whose side are we on here? And that's an internal spiritual journey we will have to take. I know that my decision was made years ago, and I'm on the side of peace. And by that I mean non-violence of thought, word and deed. And that's why I've spent a lot of time with the Buddhists and Jains. I'm filming this in the Buddhist corner of my Peace Museum here. You'll see some Buddhist stuff. This is the Buddhist corner, there's a Christian corner and a Jewish and so on. But it also makes a change because there's a bit more light here, I think. I'm sick of being filmed in the dark for my Sunday broadcasts. So the feasibility study is, I'm happy to share it, And the thing is, when I reread it, it's totally up to date. It could have been written yesterday. So I still want an Institute of Peace Studies at the University of London. I also want Peace Studies departments in every university on the planet. I used to sit on a commission with the UN. I've been to the UN headquarters for it and given expert testimony a couple of times, which was all the many of the universities of the world's chancellors or rectors working with the UN Department of Disarmament. And they had an ongoing commission that met to discuss what universities can do in the way of disarmament studies, peace studies, and non-violence research. And sitting on that commission for, nearly 10 years, I went to New York a couple of times, and then I gave written testimony when I couldn't go in person, where I sent along colleagues. And I met some amazing people through that work. At one point then, I met two scientist academics, one of whom was advising Gorbachev on demilitarizing the Soviet economy. The Russian economy at the time, in the about 1990, was heavily slanted towards militarism. It was churning out tanks and missiles and whatever, and loads of people on the payroll were working for the military. The US economy was the same. This was the Cold War, and vast numbers of personnel were working for the Pentagon and getting money from the Pentagon through some sources, including loads of academics. And I met on that commission an American academic who'd been given the job by the, I think possibly, well, certainly by the US government in some capacity. Ironically, it might have even been the Pentagon, to ask how they could demilitarize the American economy. Could you retool factories that were making nuclear warheads to make something useful? I don't know, alternative energy machines or something. How could you do that? And could there be a plan? Could there be a sort of a planned process of what they, of demilitarization of the military-industrial complex into a peace-industrial complex? So I met the Russian guy and the American guy working on that. We didn't have one in Britain. I was trying to influence British policy as much as possible because I organised meetings in the UK Parliament, in the House of Lords, trying to influence people, But what I discovered in Britain is they don't really like intellectuals in government. The party political process is almost antithetically opposite to the work of genuine intellectuals, which is to see all round an issue, to look at it in depth, to proceed, on sure footing, and above all, to look at the ethical dimensions of things. Politicians they're almost like incapable of making joined up intelligent decisions, and they have this notion of simply doing what the mob brays loudest about in the media, which usually is the complete opposite of what is actually an intelligent option. Disappointed that the British never listened to what I was bringing back from these international journeys and conferences and stuff. That's why we never got our Peace Institute in London. And Britain has carried on as a sort of homeland of militarised robots that cannot think about the ethical consequences of their foreign policy. One of the few people that did was Robin Cook, who then had to resign because we trotted along with the Iraq War in 2003 against right reason and law, and he said, "No, I'm off." And he died mysteriously quite soon afterwards. I might come back to that point, because if you do get into politics and you do have the capacity to join up more than 4 ideas, and you do come out for peace, the chances are you won't last long. You tend to get assassinated, as Kennedy was, and not only JFK but Robert Kennedy, and you name it, a whole bunch of leaders, Gandhi, whatever, who, when they come out for peace, they tend to get bumped off, which I think is scandalous. And one of the bits of research I've been doing is trying to join up the dots of all that. So the feasibility study was, epochal in my own work and career, and I published it. You can read it now. It's there online at my publishers. So now I'm going to say, in the feasibility study, I draw attention to what's going on the planet now. We're not only are we in lockdown because of the pandemic, but that's frozen some of the conflicts, but actually they're still going on. And it seems to me the undealt with issue, the big issue, the Cold War as a whole was over. But it's what we've not resolved as a planet is these ethnic and religious conflicts that are still sweeping around. And it seems to me that one of the worst triggers for this is when an ethnic majority people within a state then oppress the human rights of a minority. And you see this again and again in history and in current geopolitics, right? And this is an unsolved problem for peace thinkers. And I mention it in the foreword to my feasibility study. And I give some examples. So I've just watched a rather grim series of documentaries about the fate of the Uighur people in Central Asia, in the Tarim Basin. They're a noble, proud people. They used to be Manichaeans from the 8th to the 13th century. They were Manichaean Christians, Gnostics. And they invented an alphabet. They had a literature in Manichaean writing, which has survived in some of the caves in that region. And they actually gave their alphabet to the Mongols. The Mongolian alphabet is a descendant of Uighur alphabet. And I'd love to know more about the Uyghurs of the Manichaean era, and do we know the names of their savants and so on? It'd be fascinating to find out. They then converted to Islam, which to them was just like an update on Manichaeanism. Islam itself borrowed so much from the Manichaean traditions. Who was Mani, by the way? Yes, if you're not familiar, he was a sage, saint, scholar, mystic from Mesopotamian region. He was part Persian or Parthian, part Syrian probably. And he was an omnivore like me. He studied all different world philosophies and religions he could get his hands on. He studied Judaism, including the Kabbalah and esoteric Judaism. He studied Christianity. He was familiar with the basic Christian message, the Gospels. And he studied even esoteric stuff like the books of Enoch. He went to India and studied Buddhism and probably Jainism. He was a great lover of Buddha, and he regarded his work as a continuation of all that. He also studied Zoroastrianism, which was the Persian religion of the Parthian peoples that he was partly related to, and he believed, he loved Zoroaster. He saw what he was doing as continuing with that. And so what he was trying to do was integrate. And his own initial family grouping were a kind of Gnostic baptizers, they're called, like a sort of John the Baptist type Christian remnant. It's not quite known, but they certainly had baptismal rituals in the rivers and so on. So anyway, that was his origin, and he was an omnivore who studied, travelled about. I mean, he knew about Greek philosophy, Pythagoras, you name it. And he tried to put it all together into an integral worldview, in which basically we are fighting a war to the death against evil. The saints and sages among us, who are either Buddhist or Christian, doesn't matter what your outer garb really, have to get a bit tighter up in our connectedness and our devotion to truth. Because the forces of evil and darkness are pretty interconnected and organised. And he tried to give teachings on how to do that, how we could get more focused as spiritual warriors of light, if you want. Now, these ideas were interesting. Scholars have really only been able to reconstruct them in recent years. They found a very tiny little book, the Cologne Codex. It's written in minuscule writings about this big, which is his kind of autobiography, a life story. Some letters he wrote went up in smoke in the bombing of Berlin at the end of World War II. They were in a German museum. Irreplaceable. I don't think copies were made. This is a crime against scholarship, This is why I'm against bombing and violence and wars, because our precious books go up in flames. His idea